our presenters are presenting, all right? So without any further ado, I would like to first present to you Caitlin Morris, and she's going to tell you a little bit about San Diego State University's CARES program partnership. Caitlin, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Morris, and I am a member of the SDSU CARES initiative, along with Jamar Miles, Becky Carbett, Gage Smith, Sal Pimento, Karina Venegas, Seth Hildebrand, and Shiloh Sharp. On behalf of SDSU CARES, I want to thank Jamar for moderating the second webinar in our series, and the speakers for taking the time to discuss and educate on this important issue. Here at SDSU CARES, we know that the key to stopping hate and targeted violence in our campus community is to educate all members on the dangers of extremism. As students ourselves, we have witnessed an increase in targeted violence on campus. As such, we want to promote awareness of extremism that exists on campus via a series of webinars to improve overall campus-wide resiliency. Pardon me. We believe that by partnering with students, faculty, and staff to provide education and a space for meaningful conversations on extremism, we can achieve peace through understanding. Thank you everyone for attending this series, and I would like to turn it back over to Jamar to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, for that overview and that warm introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to read a background on our first speaker, and we will get started. So first, we're going to be presented by Ms. Cindy Cipriani. She's the Senior Management Counsel and Director of Outreach and Engagement at the Office of the U.S. Attorney and the Southern District of California. She develops partnerships and programs that further the U.S. Department of Justice's mission to prevent crime and to enforce federal laws. She also co-chairs San Diego's multidisciplinary opioid coalition, which works across sectors to raise public awareness about the vicious cycle of addiction and overdose. Ms. Cipriani obtained her bachelor's in journalism from Ohio State University and has held staff positions in the Ohio legislature and at the House of Representatives. She received her law degree from Georgetown and has held many senior management positions, including deputy chief of the Civil Division and Executive Assistant U.S. Attorney and First Assistant of the U.S. Attorney. I'd like to give to you Ms. Cindy Cipriani.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. All right, so I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate having a chance to be here with you and to give you a brief overview of what we're doing at the U.S. Attorney's Office and also the Department of Justice to really be responsive and protective of our immigrant and refugee communities. We have a very strong and vibrant refugee and immigrant community here in San Diego. I think it's one of the largest communities in the country, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with that community and partnering with leaders in that community in order to ensure that we're engaging in best practices, significant outreach, and that our community is a safe place for everyone. I mean, that's our goal on both the state, local, federal level. That's our goal. So if we can advance to the next slide. There are lots of ways in which, unfortunately, notwithstanding, I think San Diego's commitment to being a very, very strong and welcoming refugee community, there are many ways that the community is challenged. And one thing that we've seen here in San Diego is that the white supremacist movement is a growing regional threat. And in fact, the last threat assessment that I received, it showed the top 5 threats in San Diego, and the white supremacist movement growing is indeed one of those threats in San Diego. So it's very important knowing that we are aware of the ways that that impacts our community. And one way it impacts our community is that that may not be the majority of people, but unfortunately, the haters speak loudly. And as a result, we've seen that kids, Muslim kids in school, they don't feel welcome. They feel like they're bullied. 75% of refugee families feel unwelcome at school and 80% in their neighborhoods. And we've seen hate crime reports increasing. So I'm just going to take you through some of these headlines. I'm not going to talk about all these cases, but if we could advance through the headlines, you'll see that basically, unfortunately, every once in a while, we see hate crimes directed at a refugee population. We've seen people, for example, on our trolleys be attacked. We've seen hate speech turn into hate incidents that actually cause assault. And you could just advance through the rest of the headlines here, and you'll get a sense of what some of those cases have been about. We saw a Muslim woman attacked in Little Italy. We saw a young kid, Syrian refugee, 17, attacked on the trolley. And we've seen actually prosecutions brought in these cases. So we saw someone get actually 5 years for that hate attack on a Syrian refugee. But again, what we're seeing in terms of the threats is that that white supremacist violent movement has a long history in San Diego. And it's something that is protected as free speech. And yet when free speech turns to action and it turns to violence, as it did in Poway at the synagogue last year, tragically, we need to be in a position to respond. And we also need to educate our community about the ways that they can take action on their own behalfs and work to report hate crimes, to understand what a hate crime is, and to partner with law enforcement to ensure that their rights are protected at every stage. So if we could advance, I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing on prevention and enforcement. And the first thing we're doing is engaging in a lot of hate crime education and outreach. Collaboration, strong enforcement are critical, so we follow that outreach by ensuring that every single complaint is followed up on and prosecutions are brought whenever possible. We're also engaging in significant outreach and prevention efforts for houses of worship. And as we've seen last year, we had an arson attack on a mosque, and we also had the attack on the synagogue at Passover in Poway. And given that, we're very, very concerned that houses of worship understand best practices and ways that they can engage with law enforcement, engage with their community members, have security plans in place, understand the threats, and also get resources to keep houses of worship safe. In addition, we're engaging in continued refugee outreach to all of our communities in a number of different ways. And Mohammed, one of our panelists here today, has been involved in so much of that outreach. And many of our community partners have banded together to ensure that all of their communities are aware of the ways that law enforcement protects them and what their rights are when they come to this country. And often their rights are significantly different than the countries that they immigrated from. We're also working to build awareness of radicalization pathways so that when people see something, they'll say something. And if they don't feel comfortable talking to law enforcement, that there are community organizations, vetted community organizations that can step in to help, that there are mental health resources where needed. DOJ is definitely getting on board with this approach in a big way and recognizing that targeted violence incidents are growing. Our goal is to stop them before they occur. And the way we hope to do that is to have more reports from the community, threat assessments, and oftentimes what we'll see is that the assessment does not indicate, or the circumstances and facts don't indicate that there's a crime that can be prosecuted, but there are other services that can be provided. So rather than just law enforcement walking away saying there's no crime here, law enforcement wants to be able to partner with community leaders, with social service providers, with mental health experts, so that they can ensure that people get the services they need, and we can take people who are headed towards a radicalization and potentially violent pathway to get services that will enable them to return to a healthy course of action for that individual and for that community. So that's what the Disruption and Early Engagement program is about. Unfortunately, San Diego is on the cutting edge of that program. And we've got a couple other innovative San Diego programs that I'll talk about from a law enforcement perspective at the end that I think are very, very key in helping to prevent violence in our communities. So moving forward from there, the hate crimes outreach, we have engaged in this outreach in virtually every community in San Diego. And we've worked in North County, we've worked in South Bay, we've worked in the Central San Diego community, presenting panelists who can be of assistance in helping folks understand what's the difference between hate crime and hate speech. What are the ways that you can work with victim service providers, that you can understand the law enforcement, different law enforcement avenues for reporting. And what we're finding, unfortunately, is that hate crimes are dramatically underreported. So the message that we're giving in these frequent town hall events throughout San Diego and the community is that there are federal laws that protect you, that law enforcement wants to hear from you. And we tell people how to complain, and that once they do, that there will be resources provided to them and victim services that are there to help. So if we could just advance one more slide, you'll see that there is a difference between hate speech and hate crime. And as I mentioned earlier, the hate speech is protected. That's protected by our First Amendment. You can think what you want, you can say what you want, but once it crosses the line and it becomes a threat, an incitement to violence, or you're actually engaging in violence and mobilizing towards violence, then it's a hate crime. And so it's important to understand the difference, but it's also important to know that if you aren't sure whether what you're experiencing or what you've witnessed is hate speech or an actual hate crime, we want you to report it. Oftentimes, hate speech precedes hate crime. And often we are left in a situation with a hate crime. We need to prove that motivation was hatred for that incident. And oftentimes, previous hate speech enables us to get someone on law enforcement's radar. So if that person progresses to a hate crime, we can use that hate speech to prove that it was in fact a hate-related crime that is illegal. So when to report? We want you to report. If you see anything that causes you concern, we want it reported. And how to report, I'm going to go through that, but there are so many different avenues that you can report through both law enforcement and otherwise. So basically, a hate crime is one that is a criminal offense. It could be against person. It can be graffiti, drawing a swastika, for example, on synagogue property. It doesn't have to be against a person. It can be against an institution, a religious organization, or a house of worship. It must be motivated in whole or part by bias, and we need to prove that, which is why the reports are so important, even if it is just hate speech. And it has to be motivated because of the person's race, religion, disability, orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. All of those areas are protected. The way you can report, there are so many avenues. You can go to FBI, you can go to local police, campus police, you can get NGOs. So, for example, if you're an immigrant or you're an undocumented person and you feel you've been subjected to a hate crime and you're worried, if I report, am I going to be deported? There are laws that protect you. There are systems that protect you as a witness to a crime from being deported. And there are organizations who will report for you. So those are very important avenues to be aware of. So if we could advance to the next slide. Houses of worship is another focus. And in our House of Worship protective seminars, we are providing a variety of information. We have information, if we could advance to the next slide. We've provided these to hundreds of individuals, several seminars in the last couple of years, a threat briefing so people understand just what it looks like from a national and local perspective in terms of how many incidents there have been. And we hear a lot of chatter on the internet that houses of worship are viewed as potentially soft targets because perhaps they're not as they're welcoming. Organizations are welcoming to people to worship there. And so we want people to understand what the threats are. We provide them expert analysis on the threats and also resources. And we want them to understand that you can actually call DHS. There are specific protective security advisors there to help you. They will come out and actually conduct a security screening at your very organization for free to let you know where the holes are in your security setup. We also provide information on best practices, panelists who've dealt with this from the ground floor of creating security-minded approaches to actually creating full-on security programs with equipment and resources and cameras, and sometimes even armed guards. And we provide resources on how to get funding, because there are a number of different grant programs that enable religious houses of worship to seek funding and have, for example, Imam Taha here in San Diego, he had a fence put in, paid for by the government. He had security cameras installed. These are there to protect you at no cost to you, and they're there for your benefit, not for law enforcement's benefit or for surveillance purposes, but for your benefit. So there are other ways that we engage in ongoing refugee outreach, and much of that I'm doing in partnership with Muhammad and other community partners. We provided forums at SDSU when rhetoric got particularly heated during the 2016 campaign. We had a forum on fighting backlash against our Muslim community. If we could advance. We also have had a Somali enforcement and community law enforcement and Somali community roundtable that met frequently to provide resources. We had a youth and athletic fair, and at this fair you could see the community interacting positively with law enforcement, everybody from the U.S. Attorney to the head of the FBI to the San Diego Police Department. So it's these kinds of events where you're forming bonds and relationships. And I think that that enables people to feel much more comfortable about reporting, so that when they do have an incident, they're viewing law enforcement as a trusted partner. We could move to the next. It's also important because rights differ so much, and the rights are so full and expansive here under our Bill of Rights in the Constitution for people to understand exactly what their rights are. So in partnership with Muhammad, we've provided Know Your Constitutional Rights events, both in the Somali community and also at SDSU. You can advance. And every year we've actually organized, and it's so difficult to be passing on that this year as a result of social distancing, but we've had a very vibrant and fun celebration where law enforcement and the Muslim community come together to celebrate an iftar dinner during Ramadan. And that's been a really meaningful program that is, I think now it's like almost like a family event that we hold every year that I think has become near and dear to all of us. So when we engage in prevention programs, I think it's really important, if we could back up one slide so I can just hit on those points. I think it's really important to keep a couple of things in mind from the law enforcement perspective. So we always want to make sure that we are keeping a program to be totally inclusive, so that we're not just targeting one community or focusing on one community. We want to be sure that it represents all communities and that nobody feels stigmatized by the program. We also want to ensure that we are working with the community and actually ensuring that we're putting it on with the community members. So we want to make sure we protect the right to free speech as part of that program, that we're not actually labeling something as extremism, when in fact it's simply free speech. It's somebody's right to say what they believe, and that is supremely protected under First Amendment. And it's always best, when you look at what role law enforcement should play, that law enforcement plays that role with the community. So Muhammad and I have put on some of these programs together because it's really important for community members to know that it's a program that benefits the community and that there's a community partnership behind that program and not just law enforcement. We can move to the next slide. So as part of that, and Muhammad will talk a little more about this, I think, but we do have a community awareness briefing, and that helps people understand how people radicalize to violence, what that might look like, why people join, how the recruiting process works, the role of social media, what people can do to prevent it, and who to talk to when you have concerns. And that's really important. So if we can go to the next slide, the bystanders are important. And we've seen 80% of the cases where violence occurred, there were people who were aware of signals beforehand. And that was true in the case of Dylan Roof and in so many other cases. And what we're seeing is that messaging platforms all over the internet ensure that we're living in a world full of propaganda. And the next slide will show some of those messaging platforms. And we've seen that many of the incidents that have occurred, some of the most frightening and horrifying incidents, have been live streamed on social media, have been talked about, bragged about on social media. And so oftentimes we've seen sites that when they catch fire, we need to take action to shut them down, but it becomes very difficult to do that. And 8chan is an example of that. So in 8chan, this is where the New Zealand actor basically talked about and streamed his incident in New Zealand against the mosque. And there was a lot of pushback against 8chan. And as a result, 8chan was taken down. And in fact, the San Diego actor who attacked the mosque and also the synagogue was motivated by the 8chan's terribly, terribly hateful speech and the streaming on 8chan. So it got shut down, but a couple months later, it opened up as another site. So we're seeing that it's very, very important to monitor what's on these sites, to understand how dangerous these sites are. But it's also important to recognize that it's an uphill battle to shut these sites down. And as much as we're asking these platforms to accept responsibility and to shut the sites down, we all need to be cognizant, and we need to look when we're seeing a threat on the sites. We need to be aware of the reporting avenues. So about those reporting avenues, DOJ's Disruption and Early Engagement Program is designed to ensure that once you do report, that there is an early threat assessment against somebody that the community believes or someone believes may be mobilizing to violence. And we're working to connect that individual to mental health resources and to partner with community leaders. So if someone doesn't feel comfortable talking to law enforcement, we're very much hoping that they will find a community leader to speak with. And here in San Diego, we're hoping that the county, which is working on 211 resources, will have a system soon for vetting those kinds of complaints in a way that could be anonymous, that could be very comfortable for the reporting party, and then we'll end up providing really meaningful resources to somebody who could be on his way to or her way to engaging in violence. Okay, next slide. Some of the other ways that we're working to prevent violence here in San Diego from a law enforcement standpoint is we do have, very fortunately, access to something called GVROs, gun violence restraining orders. So when we believe that somebody is experiencing mental health problems or could be mobilizing towards violence, and perhaps they have not committed a crime yet, but they may have access to significant weapons, we're able to go into court and obtain a TRO to actually remove the guns, at least until the person has sought treatment and has been declared safe. And this can be useful even when somebody is potentially contemplating suicide. We can get those, and this is done through the city attorney's office. And our city attorney, Mara Elliott, has been at the very forefront of this groundbreaking program. Another program is the school safety protocol. Every single incident where somebody is concerned about a threat in school now becomes reported. And so, for example, if somebody draws a super frightening drawing as part of an art project, or makes a very, very aggressive, violent statement or threat as part of an essay project, those will be reported, and we'll be taking a look at that and looking at ways to develop resources. So thank you for your attention. I hope this was useful, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists and responding to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. That was excellent. Before I introduce our next speaker, I wanted to remind everyone that send me your questions, Jamar Miles, as co-host, so that we can address those to all three of our presenters at the end. All right. So without further ado, I want to change gears and introduce Ismail Warsami, representing Oregon State University. He's a native of Somalia and a former war refugee. He's multilingual and well-traveled throughout the world. In fact, he's presented in over a dozen countries and has also presented in about 4 Canadian provinces. Since entering higher education back in 2010, he's worn many hats. He's recruited students domestically and internationally and implemented, tested various software systems. Plus, he's also taught at the graduate and undergraduate levels. He holds a bachelor's in international affairs and a master's in education from the University of Maine. He studied abroad at the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and currently serves at Oregon State University as the Assistant Director at Diversity and Cultural Engagement. I present to you Ismail Warsami.
And following Cindy's amazing presentation about what's going on with regards to folks, how things are happening, and how how things are experienced by people, I would like to have a really deep conversation and an honest conversation about also how policy sometimes, unfortunately, creates or perpetuates some of these attacks or some of these issues. So case in point, if you look at media, rhetoric, whether that's by politicians or whether that's even some policies that I will get into, there has been a lot of negatives, especially against our vulnerable population, whether those are folks coming from migrants from South and Central America, or Syrian refugees, or Muslims or Sikhs, or our Jewish communities. Folks that are generally speaking a target tend to have unfortunately a lot of rhetoric or media bias against them. If we move to the next slide, you will see every time we see the terror meter or terror alert goes up, people get suspicious. And generally speaking, and even not just even like actual physical terrorism, but every time people feel scared, they look for scapegoats. And that is average people doing that, but that's also sometimes politicians thinking about policies like, what can we do?
I'd like to introduce you.
Was that? Yes. So if you can see this, so then going forward, I just want to bring your attention to some actual practices or things that can lead to a radicalization of some of these folks on the edge from these communities, but also attacks about these same very vulnerable communities. So if we move to the next slide, you will see, for example, that if you, I mean, this is both anecdotally, but also quantitative data out there compiled by many civil liberties organizations and social justice advocates, whether that's American Civil Liberties Union or Council on American Islamic Relations, that you will see that there have been a disproportionate impact on folks that are that are identified as Muslims or citizens of majority Muslim countries, Muslim Americans, international students, current or foreign or former refugees, or people who have traveled to quote unquote hotspots. And those are really, generally speaking, countries that are also have been put in some kind of lists. So you will see that folks like that, and I think I'm speaking of myself. There will be a lot of questioning, and there will be what we call secondary inspection. And secondary inspection is not the regular inspection which normal vast majority of people will go through. So you will see that things that's supposed to be random or supposed to be behavior driven will be targeted at people just because they happen to have a name that is like Muhammad or Ahmed or something of that nature. And those, or they might have traveled to, let's say, Saudi Arabia for for Hajj or pilgrimage. Those are the issues that are not related necessarily to a specific occurrence or a specific actual threat, but simply because the person happens to have visited this. So that obviously will lead to then an impact on those on these vulnerable populations. So if we go to even further, we will see that people will be asked to explain or explain very redundant questions like, for example, I'll talk about myself. Just recently, about a few months ago, I've gone to Somalia to deliver aid that I raised with a number of folks to help victims of flooding. And when I came back, some of the questions that I was asked was, have I encountered any terrorists? And I was, I expected. I wasn't really puzzled. I should have been puzzled because it's not something that you don't deliver aid and then you encounter terrorists. But that was something that a lot of folks who happen to have those identities are kind of used to it. So we kind of rehearse what we're going to answer. And you really have to be very serious because some of these questions will be very, very stupid and redundant. Like they will ask you the same question in 5 different ways. And if you one time either sarcastically answered it, because I also learned that lesson that I was at some point sarcastic, and the question was, so I don't remember the exact question, but it was, I tried to answer sarcastically, and that kind of led to a couple hours more. So they will ask you to go through your phone. I already opened my phone. I didn't have to. They did not have a right to open my phone. They could have confiscated, but they don't have to. I don't have to give them a password. But because I knew it was going to mean longer hours, and I had another flight to catch, I just volunteered, and I gave them all the documents. I gave them actually more pictures and videos and things I was doing. So the person I was talking to at that point realized that, I'm quote unquote harmless. So I moved through. So the other things that also happened, and unfortunately also under at least 2 different presidents that happened, was the policy that's called NSEERS, or National Security Entry Registration System. This is a policy that I'm very familiar with. Many folks, I think, especially in higher ed, are familiar with because there were about 34 countries, or a number of countries, that were put in that, mostly majority Muslim countries, that anyone who comes, not anyone, a lot of folks at random who come from those countries were subject to a very, very intrusive registration process. So that, for example, the person, let's say from Tunisia, for example, who might have been in that, it also disproportionately impacted males, young males, between, let's say, 18 and 25 or so. And if you were somehow, when you enter the country, and a lot of them international students also, when you enter the country, if they stamp your passport with NSEERS, like it was just kind of like a visa stamp or entry stamp, then throughout your stay in the United States, every single time you travel, you have to call them ahead of time, and you have to tell people at the Customs and Border Protection what your trip plans are. You would have to fax things to them. It was very cumbersome, and it also scares people, and it didn't really prevent anything because the person is already here. So luckily, it was actually it was abolished, or it was rescinded by President Obama, but it is something that really lasted until very recently. So the other thing that also it encourages, all of those things kind of encourage a number of, especially, a lot of media folks, or a lot of just vigilantes in the United States, to then go ahead and just spew hatred. And those things will actually eventually kind of work their way out to an encourage fix. So I'm just want to talk about 2 types of inner core, especially a lot of the folks that are, that happen to be Muslims, for example, that were targeted. It wasn't just random things happening. It was well-coordinated, well-oiled, well-funded machine that, for example, that had one that was groups of inner core that actually their entire purpose or agenda or existence is just to either marginalize, spew a hatred, come up with all kinds of conspiracies. And those conspiracies don't have to only impact Muslims. They impacted Sikhs. They impacted even President Obama. I mean, there are people that think that President Obama's name stands for COVID-19, and they have ways that they play around with the numbers. And you've heard about the whole birther movement. All of those things have roots in Islamophobia. And the outer core are a group whose primary purpose was not necessarily to target Muslims and immigrants by extension or minorities, but they just happen to be, their jobs, I mean, their work just kind of inadvertently does that. So I want to, I mean, if we move to the next slide, you will see the groups that are the inner core that I mentioned, and you can see how much money that they spent on these different various targeted, deliberate discriminations. And those actually sometimes, unfortunately, led to actual laws and policy. And we'll talk about we'll talk about those laws. So if you move then to the outer core, you can see then a list of other folks, and that happen to be folks who have either radio talk show or other organizations, or conspiracy theorists, also individuals with megaphones. They could mean a lot of things, but it's very important. And these are well documented, organizations, individuals, and you can see some of the examples here. If we go and the next slide will show you an actual map. No, not this one. So many of these folks will advocate for what they call Sharia, anti-Sharia laws. And as you know, the United States already has a constitution, which is the law of the land. There is no way that any other law is going to supersede anyway. So you don't actually need to make a new law to say, like, let's say, we're not subject to Chinese law. We're not subject to Scandinavian countries' law. You don't have to say that, because by default, the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So, but unfortunately, a lot of these folks actually came up with laws that were guised as, or are kind of coded as anti-Sharia, but they became anti-Muslim. So you could see from East Coast to West, the other slide will show you also on the West Coast. As you can predict, they happen to be concentrated in certain states, but all of these states are states that either have laws that either proposed or even passed, some of them. So as you can see, it's pretty much widespread, and this data is actually a few years behind. So if you even look at the newer one, you will even see more expansion. And they're not done yet. They're continuing to continue to see, and these will have consequences for our students. As you can see, there were regular attacks and regular discriminations against our students by a lot of those various different entities. And sometimes, unfortunately, even community members who were just fed, because media, we all consume media, whether we like it or not. We get a lot of different messages. It comes in movies, it comes in pop culture, it comes in so many different ways. So whether we are conscious or subconsciously doing it, every one of us. So we have to make a conscientious choice to actually try to filter these things out. And unfortunately, the impacts, like I said, is not going to be limited to individual groups. I mean, definitely our students who come from any country in the world, when they see anyone getting targeted, they also feel the impact. We know, for example, right now we have a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric happening. People, calling the coronavirus Chinese virus. That's a big deal, because once you associate something with people, then people will tend to look at those people differently. People didn't have to be even a person in China. It could be someone in Chinatown. And same thing goes for when you say folks are rapists, or they come into this country, they're killing us, they're invading us, they're murderers. Then average person who doesn't necessarily have a lot of sophistications to understand that's not really true, they might take the matters into their hands. And that's what happens, unfortunately, sometimes. So it's a kind of a mental picture that it creates. A propaganda really deeply takes root in people's psyches. So like after 9/11, people kind of got used to they kind of had, every time they think of a Muslim, they think of an extremist, and vice versa. When they think of extreme action, even though we know, even data in our country, in this United States right now, we know the number one perpetrators of extreme violence happen to be male white extremists. That doesn't mean all white folks are dangerous, but that just shows you that if we are going by, if our policies were data driven, you would have seen people being banned. I mean, people from South Carolina might be banned from coming to, from Massachusetts or something like that. But instead, we see countries that had never attacked the United States were banned, a list of them. And for what? And that, if that wasn't enough, just a couple of weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, we also had another ban that was now, because of the coronavirus, we have an entire immigration shutdown. And our refugee populations are already impacted. If you look at countries like Canada, where per capita, they've been taking refugees in by a lot. And it doesn't have to be Canada. Germany, Turkey, a lot of the European countries were doing much better. So if you look at terrorism, then if you associate terrorism with just anyone that the United States doesn't like it, or anybody who attacks the United States, then that just becomes just a name calling. But if you're really thinking about, and it's not just the United States, if you're saying that it's only terrorism when certain people do it, what you're going to create is that you will perpetuate that. It has to be in a way that's more broader, more humanitarian thinking, which says we reject all forms of terrorism. And that's something that's going to resonate with everybody, because who doesn't want safety for themselves? Who doesn't want to support that? But if it becomes like arbitrary, that anyone I don't like is something that I just give them a label, then it will become meaningless. And unfortunately, right now, as it is almost meaningless, the way we do it, because nobody almost goes by the dictionary definition. So let's just all sort out our moral values, and we'll take your questions. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for that. That was very, very informative. As I said before, please keep your questions coming in the chat, and we will address those shortly after our third presenter. So last but certainly not the least, it's my pleasure to present to you my very own professor, Professor Mohammed Ahmed. He serves as the Associate Chief Diversity Officer at San Diego State University, and he's a professor of preventing and countering violent extremism in our Homeland Security program. Additionally, he serves as the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the American Counterterrorism Targeting and Resilience Institute. He received his bachelor's in International Security and Conflict Resolution and a master's in post-secondary education and leadership from San Diego State University. He's currently pursuing a PhD in higher education at Old Dominion University, and previously he's worked as the Senior Community Engagement Coordinator at the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. Without further ado, Professor Mohammed Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Jamar. It's really hard to go present after Cindy and Ismail. I think they've outlined all of the challenges that exist and how they impact our immigrant and refugee communities. But I want to go back to the fundamentals just a little bit. Let's talk about violent extremism. You know, if you look at this image I have on the screen, who does that really entail? It could be anybody from any background. Anybody could be a violent extremist or hold violent extremist ideologies. In fact, evidence shows and demonstrates that violent extremists come from all backgrounds. There is no one profile. So I just want to put a strong emphasis in that. There is no one profile. Some of the misconceptions is that Muslims are terrorists, they're extremists, you know, they want to enforce their Sharia law, or they want to come to our country, you know, and enforce their beliefs upon us. So whether it's through the media or even textbooks, or just, you know, interactions with the general public, the misconception is associating an entire faith or background with extremism, and that is not the case. On the other hand, when you look at domestic extremism, some of the rhetoric could be, it's poor white people. It's poor, you know, white male who live, you know, in the South, who are gun owners, who are, you know, extremists, who are committing all these school shootings. That is also not true. So it's not we should not sort of categorize violent extremism with certain particular groups, and that is actually quite dangerous and leads to radicalization among the communities. So there is no one profile. An extremist could be from any religious background, any ethnic background, and any cultural background. Moving on, let's understand radicalization and mobilization. Radicalization is the process by which individuals come to believe their engagement or in facilitation of non-state violence to achieve social and political change is necessary and justified. It's important to understand that the laws of this country, under the Constitution, being radical is protected by the US Constitution. We have many, many, many people that are radical in our country and throughout the world. You have artists, you have sports, people who play in sports, you have individuals that are from various different, whether you're faculty or students. So it's understanding that it's protected to have radical thoughts, because these are your thoughts, even though they may not be healthy, but nevertheless, it's protected by the Constitution. Now, when it comes to mobilization, mobilization is the process by which individuals take action to prepare or engage in violence or material support of violence to advance their cause. So when an individual moves from being radical to mobilizing to take action, this is where the law does not allow to happen. So when you start to mobilize, and mobilization, for example, individual could hold, you know what, I don't like Muslims. Muslims don't believe, don't belong in this country. We should ban the Quran. We should hold the Quran burning day. It's fine, right? Those are your radical views. But once you start engaging in taking action, right, purchasing weapons, right, or donating to an organization which is considered a material support that violently attacks Muslims, this is when law enforcement steps in, and this is when the Constitution says these are criminal activities. So remember, there are many people in our society, whether they're positive or negative, that have radical views, and it's okay to do that. It's protected. But once you start to enter the phase of mobilization, that's when issues start to arrive. Let's look at some of the drivers that takes an individual, right, moving in from being radicalized into the process of to take into violence, and it happens throughout various different stages. There is no common driver or pathway to violent extremism. In general, however, we can group these drivers into 5 buckets, which are personal, community, socio-political, group dynamics, and ideological. To unpack this a little bit more, for example, when we talk about the personal factors, this could be someone that, is looking for belonging or purpose, right? Someone that, may not have a good, social circle, someone that might have came out of a really bad relationship or might have lost someone important to them in their life, someone who's personally down on their luck, could be, vulnerable for recruitment. Let's look at the community factor, right? So you have individuals who are part of a larger community and, feeling that they're being targeted, whether it's a religious discrimination, right? You can look at the Muslim community who feels like, they're being targeted. You have graffiti, you have mosques that were bombed here in the US, believe it or not, and it, did not even make it to the nightly news. You have communities that have tension with law enforcement. You have communities that are concerned about, their civil rights and their civil liberties. So a lot of these, challenges could put someone, right, in that space where they're looking for, a way out. For the social political perspectives, these are basically grievances and frustrations, especially with policies. You have individuals that are, believe in that the U.S. government is not protecting our borders. We have all these people coming in from South America, and they're taking our jobs, they're taking our housing, they're on welfare, they're exhausting our tax and our resources, and we're left out in the process, right? So they're frustrated, whatever grievances that they have against the political system. Some might say, why are we sending our taxpayer money to these foreign countries that don't like us? You know, we should completely cut foreign aid that we're sending to countries. So a lot of these things, and you start to see this with a lot of our individuals who are, you know, carrying out these extreme violent attacks against minority communities. It's always more than likely they have issues with government. It's the government policies that are allowing them not to have a job, you know, for someone who's an immigrant taking their job or taking, you know, their opportunities that they have. So it's an ideology of, you know, we need to take our country back, which is quite dangerous. Understanding the group dynamics, you know, it's basically, you know, creating an echo chamber within, you know, social circles and groups that you might be affiliated with. And it's also, it pushes into dehumanizing opponents. So it's creating us against them. You know, you're liberal, I'm conservative. You know, we may not agree. Sometimes, you know, we're going to have to use force. So a lot of the group dynamics, people hold groups and what they stand for into, you know, strong social beliefs. And lastly, the ideology. This is often present at some point in the radicalization process when people are moving, remember, from radicalization into violence process. Contrary to the common belief, it is not always the main driver, or it may not be the only driver or the main driver, but it occurs at a later process when this person had these ideologies that they were dealing with. So what are some of the similarities against violent extremist groups, right? So there's tons of them. For example, you look at Al-Qaeda, you look at Al-Shabaab, you look at ISIS. These are violent extremist groups. When you look at the, you know, sovereign citizens, and you look at, you know, skinheads and white supremacy movements, what are the similarities that they have? Some of the similarities, for example, is they look for vulnerabilities. When these individuals are recruiting members to join their groups, they tend to look at people that are vulnerable, that are down on their luck. Someone who's lost a job, someone who's looking for belonging, someone who's having, you know, minor issues or issues with family, someone who's dropped out of school, someone who's looking for someone, right, to show them respect and honor them and to you know, to encourage them. That is, you know, exploiting vulnerabilities. So that is one of the first stages that they bring people in. And then they focus on grievances, leveraging real or perceived political injustices or community conflicts. This is, you know, this is real. When people are recruiting, for example, when white supremacy or domestic extremist movements, when they're recruiting individuals to you know, carry out these attacks or believe in their message, they're not just coming out with things that are you know, just, you know, out of the blue. For example, there might be an individual in the Muslim community or the larger, or maybe the African American community, or there might be someone from a Hispanic or Mexican or Latin American background who commits a crime, and they justify it, and they saying, look, we need to hold these people accountable. These people are ruining our country. They're taking our democracy, and if we don't do something about it, we're going to lose our country. So that is some of the ways that they tend to radicalize and focus on actual grievances that might exist. Providing a collective identity. Once again, someone who's looking for belonging, they tend to, you know, some of these, you know, for example, organizations, there are cases, you know, there are case studies where a student who was in college dropped out and joined a local skinhead organization. Dropped out because he couldn't, you know, pay for his school. He didn't have the finances. He lost his job. They cover his bills. They show him support. Obviously, you know, their end goal is for this individual to carry out attacks and believe in their ideology. But nevertheless, it's not like they're treating people bad within them. Right. So that is some of the things that they show a collective identity, that we're, you know, we're a group that supports each other, that loves each other, and also protects each other. Moving on, the similarities among violent extremist groups is they hold polarizing narratives. This is, there is no critical thinking or nuance, but rather us versus them point of view. And it's very polarizing and black and white. So especially in the political environment that we're in our country, it's either you're, pro the travel ban, or you're, supporting Muslim terrorists. You're either want to, build walls to protect our border, or, you're bringing in rapists and drug dealers into our country. So there is no middle ground. There is no rationale that they have. These people that are, have these ideologies of violent extremism. It's always against us against them, and there is no middle ground. There is no room for debate, honestly, healthy debate anymore, and that is very problematic. And last but not least, they promote violence as an action, as the only action. They don't say, let's go to the voting poll, let's vote, or let's have a debate, or let's lobby to change policies. People who are in these violent extremist organizations, whether you're looking at international terrorism or ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or Al-Shabaab, or you're looking at domestic terrorist organizations, their only solution that they tell the people that who believe in their message is that violence is the only option, and there is no other option. And it's also important to understand, and Ismail talked about how some of the policies could impact our communities and tend to lead, our communities to be on the receiving end of violence and hate crime. For example, when someone from a Muslim background of any sort or ethnicity commits an act of violence, the narrative has been, terrorism. But when you have multiple, and communities are talking about this all across the country, when you have multiple, hate crimes and mass shootings that are carried out by white supremacists, it's, it has been, there's mental health issue there. Let's look at if this person had family, issues. This person might have lost their jobs, when it's clear that these individuals carried out these attacks because they hated this community and they believed in ideology that they were more superior than against this race or this, demographic of community that they've, carried out the attack. Mostly, Sikh communities that they mistakenly shoot and kill because they think they're Muslims. Jewish, our local Jewish communities have been also impacted by, violent, ambitious attacks. But when you look at the country's, our country's laws, they were called domestic extremist movements. So there was no law that said to classify them as terrorists. Now that is changing. The FBI, after many community uproar and challenge and protest, now they're finally classifying, domestic extremist movements for what they really are, which are terrorist organizations. So now when they go to court and they carry out attacks, they're being charged with terrorism. Moving on, there are, three different steps. Number one, when, for the narratives and how polarizing they are. Number one, we're part of our global community. The government has brought ruin to us and disgraced us. We are the targets of government aggression. When you look at white supremacist organizations or domestic terrorist organizations, their biggest beef or their biggest issue is with government. It is always the government's fault. We have an increase in Muslim communities, in the state. It's the government's fault. It's the immigration, right? We're bringing in all of this. We have a influx of Hispanic communities that are, either getting more jobs or whatever. They're, working hard, and that becomes a problem. It's always the government's problem. The second stage is, therefore, the government is at war with us. And lastly, we must counter this with violence. But sometimes they're directly attacking, for example, Timothy McVeigh, targeting government buildings. You have anarchists who are anti, government. They target law enforcement officers, but particularly when you look at individuals that hate minority communities, right? They don't target government. They target the communities themselves. So it's important that the government understands that there is a responsibility in protecting these communities. And that's why we're seeing more initiatives such as protecting houses of worship are coming to fruition. And communities also need to take, a precaution and safety measures to protect themselves and be ahead of the curve in making sure that, if they're seeing something, they're reporting, and the reporting of hate crimes. Most of our minority, immigrant, and refugee communities, when they're faced with hate crimes, more than likely they're not reporting it. And that is because of fear and fear of retaliation. So law enforcement definitely needs to do a better job in doing outreach and educating the community about on how to report these hate crimes. Moving on with that, here are some of the slogans that bring a lot of that violent extremist narratives to our communities. A lot of the domestic terrorist organizations, they believe that diversity is a code word for white genocide. Now, posters and slogans like this, you're finding it at local grocery stores, you're finding it in communities just posted on walls, you're finding it more and more in higher education institutions, right? Look at the image, it's a little blonde white girl who's crying, very sad, very emotional. But the problem is the message that they're giving is that diversity is a code word for white genocide, which means if we want to take back what is rightfully ours, we need to fight against diversity. And that message leads to violence, and we've seen that all across the country against refugee and immigrant communities. Let's look at some of the hate crimes against our refugee and immigrant communities. There are tons. When I was doing this research, which one should I pick? It's just literally I don't think we go out a few weeks without an incident of hate crime targeting Muslim or immigrant or refugee or Hispanic, Latino communities, African American communities by domestic terrorist organizations. The first image, believe it or not, it's in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is a mosque that was bombed. No joke, it was bombed by individuals that thankfully are arrested right now and going through their trial and hopefully convicted. But they bombed the mosque. How I found about this, honestly, I learned it through my friends in the Somali community. Immediately, I went to the news. I could not find anything, whether it was CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and that's the challenge that exists as well. A lot of the bias that exists within the media that people tend to believe, oh, this is exaggerating. I haven't heard about this. People say, Muslims are being attacked or, African Americans are being attacked. It does not make it to the news, and that has been a challenge. The other image, this is a young, San Diego immigrant and refugee student who was on a trolley. He was riding the trolley back to his house, and he was viciously attacked by people who hold the ideology that you're speaking Arabic, you're speaking Muslim, you don't belong here. This is not the language of this country, and they violently attacked him. You had one of my closest friends here in San Diego who was attacked at his Zappy's Pizza. This is a popular pizza shop within, in the heart of the immigrant and refugee communities, and he stood up for, when there was a few individuals who were bullying some of the sisters in the community because they were wearing the hijab. And he said, you should not bully them. You should leave them alone. They're just trying to, order their pizza. And they took out their anger on him and said, you don't belong in this country. You should be on the travel ban, blah, blah, blah. They've been arrested and they've been convicted. I believe convicted, thankfully. But that is some of the challenges. And another example is broad daylight. This man has violently attacked 3 Muslim women, once again, for wearing hijab. And he threw them around, pulled their hijabs. Thankfully, people have stepped in and confronted him and stopped him from further, hurting these poor girls. However, when police went to arrest him and they identified him, he was on his way out and he had a gun with a silencer. And his intentions was to go back and to kill them. Thankfully, law enforcement have stopped that from happening. So these challenges exist all across the country. And then, outside of the country where you have many immigrant and refugee communities that are faced with violence, like that tragic incident that happened in New Zealand. You had, Dylan Roof, who attacked, killed 9 African-American worshipers at a very historic Black church in Charleston. So a lot of these things are impacting our community. Now let's talk about, how could we address this? How can we make our communities are more resilient and they're safer due to these challenges? For example, number 1 is, addressing the vulnerabilities and increase individual, family, and community resiliency. This is making sure that, we're including people in our community. We understand that we're taking time to understand that some of our people in our community might be down on luck. If someone needs help, some of these people might be dealing with, mental health issues before they go out and they attack because there's no other option and they, get in touch with the wrong people. Be conscious and be supportive. Number 2, be conscious of the grievances. So if you're starting to see people talking about, African Americans this or Muslims this or the Asian American community, they're responsible for the coronavirus and all of that stuff. They might have some grievances. And there might be being radicalized by, violent extremist groups. So making, sure that you understand and you're able to provide, some sort of support, and sometimes, reporting it to law enforcement is going to help save lives, believe it or not. Provide a community of interest, perhaps a local center in the community, or more likely it could be an online community such as, a blog, social media network. Youth especially have, a sense of belonging according to a lot of, developmental theories. So providing a community of interest and supporting our most vulnerable members in our community is going to be very crucial, and not, just ignoring it before it's too late. Promoting civic engagement as a solution. A lot of people who have grievances, once again, what is the best way? Instead of going, and hating and, accumulating a lot of hate, you have to understand that there are diplomatic ways to address your issues. Be civically involved, run for public office if you want to change, some of these laws. If you want to focus on, having, securing the border or whatever the case that you might be passionate about. Violence is never an option, but there should be a counter narrative, and that should be civic engagement as a solution. And be alert, of the, polarizing narratives that exist. If someone is calling for violence as the only solution, take steps, contact law enforcement. If you see something, say something, and that is a huge deal. If you see something, say something. Oftentimes, a lot of these violent, attacks or school shootings, someone saw something and said, it's none of my business. Or someone said, oh, maybe, I don't want to be rude, or I don't want to be racist, in calling, law enforcement in. You have to say something. There is an incident in San Diego where you had a individual that is linked with white supremacists who was living in a hotel. This individual had maps on the wall in downtown San Diego. He had pinpoints of where he was going to attack and kill a lot of innocent people. Someone got suspicious and thankfully called the law enforcement, and they went in his hotel room, and literally they found tons of ammunitions and weapons. So that individual, saved lives, honestly, and it could have been anybody in San Diego during that time. What can you do, for your community? Create a community-based intervention programs. Very important. Get together with your community leaders, parents, local city officials. Figure out ways to create intervention programs that are not problematic, that are not demonizing towards communities, that are not targeting communities or associating communities with law enforcement, violent extremism. Develop local programs based on violence prevention models. So every city across the country is, it's coming up with plans to address these issues. But this is really to our immigrant and refugee communities. You need to be involved. A lot of the challenges, especially when it comes to programs that counter violent extremism, communities were never at the table, and it becomes a problem. And a lot of these, programs, when they do come to existence, the challenge and the narrative becomes that, this is intelligence gathering. Our community is being associated with these things. So remember, it's you need to be at the table, take the initiative, create programs to keep our community safe, protecting, our houses of worship, but understanding there are people out there that are hateful toward our, immigrant and refugee communities. And there needs to be programs that need to be created to de-radicalize them or to educate them as well. Challenge, violent extremist narratives, have a counter narrative. Every community has, the opportunity to educate the larger public on what their community is about, what their culture is, what their identity is. And once you start to do that and engage in activities like that, you're bringing cultures together and creating a community cohesion. And host, community awareness briefings, such as the program we're having today. These are very important. We're educating, the larger public. They should be taught in schools about, the dangers of violent extremism, how to, create effective prevention and intervention programs. So a lot of these things are just community resources, but many times we cannot, as immigrant and refugee communities, rely on government. A lot of this we have to do ourselves. We have to take the initiative. We've done that here in San Diego, and people from the immigrant and refugee communities are doing that across many other cities across the country as well. So being proactive, and that is end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to dig into our chat block, and we're going to field a couple of questions for our three presenters. So if you'll please give me one moment, and if you have some, please send it over. Okay, so one of the first questions that we have, and this is actually for all three presenters, what can we do to create a more inclusive environment for our immigrants and refugee communities? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll start with that. I think San Diego's taken some really important steps. So for the first time, they actually created a director of immigrant relationships. So that individual is responsible for making sure that every single person who enters the city as an immigrant or refugee is made to feel welcome. There's actually a group that Estela de la Rios works with that basically has welcoming sessions with them, and at these sessions they get to meet folks in law enforcement and community players that may be of assistance to them. So I feel San Diego is doing many of the right things. I think that the effort has to be spread far and wide. We have a large county, and hopefully all of our counties will catch on with this kind of approach, because the refugees are certainly not just in San Diego. There are other aspects, other parts of San Diego County. But I think that there are things we can do on the very front end when people walk in into the door of our country to let them know what their rights are, that they're welcome, and to provide them with resources.
Yeah, great question. It really depends on how involved the community has to be. I understand that communities have language barriers. Communities are especially our immigrant refugee communities. They're some of our for example, our communities fled dictatorships. So you did not engage law enforcement, or you did not challenge government on policy or whatever the case might be. So they tend to just ignore the situation and deal with the consequences later. So encouraging the communities to do outreach. Some of the things that we've done here in San Diego is we've done the outreach. We've reached out to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Mayor's Office, law enforcement agencies, and saying, hey, let's come to the round table. Let's discuss on how we could work together to address, the various different challenges that exist in our community, whether it's economics, whether it's, public safety, whether it's, education. And oftentimes, government and city officials and a lot of these agencies and organizations, they're prepared to support and help. But the initiative really needs to come from the community. And there is a sense of responsibility that government and law enforcement have in protecting the community as well. So they need to do a better job in understanding the cultural sensitivities and engaging with the communities, not to just come in, guns blazing and saying, this is happening, or I often tell law enforcement agencies that attending a banquet once every few months is not community engagement. Community engagement is when you have constant presence in the community, where you're able to help the community even outside of public safety, to earn their trust and credibility that you have with them. So it's a responsibility on both sides, but it's going to take leadership. It's going to take, especially our younger generation, that understand the new American system, and how that understand our civil rights and liberties, to engage and create these opportunities to protect our community at all levels.
Yeah, I'd like to add, like everyone else said, there's really no replacement for the hard work to create bridges with community, and it's not when there's a problem. So a lot of times, a lot of law enforcement, a lot of even city governments, state governments, higher education, we're very good about reacting, but we're not very good about being proactive and build. And I've spent the last 3 years or so managing crises. What I learned is when you need to build bridges is not when you have the crisis. If you don't have people that will trust you, that will talk to you and engage with you before you had a crisis, by the time you have a crisis, it is only going to go bad. And you have to understand, some of these communities have been under attack for many years from both government officials and also from other, entities. So they're very skeptical. Even myself doing this presentation today, I got a lot of criticism telling me, why are you doing this? Why are you kind of legitimizing that we have any extremism problem, the whole notion. And I was like, no, that's not at all what I'm doing. I am trying to give voice, because if I don't be on those tables, who will be? And that's what I would like to see more of.
Well, we're coming up with the next question. I would also mention, I think a big part of building trust is having a law enforcement community that represents the community at large. And so it's important to recruit and to ensure that you have law enforcement officers who are representative of the community at large. And that often helps to build the bridges as well.
All right, thank you for that, and that's definitely a valid point. I have another question from the chat. How can we make refugees and immigrants feel welcome on our school campuses? Work at San Diego State and also with Oregon State.
You want to go first, or you want me to go first?
I mean, I could go first. So there are a lot of things that you can do. Like I think everyone said here, engagement, meaningful engagements. And I'll give you an example. Our local mayor comes to graduation, comes to student orientation. At some point, I remember giving people like certificate of Corvallis citizenship. So that shows just not those who happen to be in those areas, but it shows that our city is open and our university is welcoming. It doesn't mean we're problem free. We've had a lot of the things that you've mentioned. We've had the arson attack in our local mosque. We are very close to Portland area where we had another attack of a train that unfortunately 3 people lost their lives. So we know those things happen, but when you see that folks are trying to do their best, and we have to understand when it comes to law enforcement, they have to, I mean, one incident puts them back 10 steps back. So they need to be constantly doing this, and they need to be partnering with those other entities, whether that's higher ed or K through 12 system or city governments, that they are constantly being vulnerable and not being defensive. Because a lot of times people will just be defensive and they explain the thing away. Don't try to do that, because communities that are vulnerable understand that it is only making the worst situation, a bad situation, even worse. Yeah,
absolutely. And just to, piggyback off of what Ismail said, us as a higher education institutions, we need to really put a strong focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. College campuses across the country are seeing an uptick in domestic extremist rhetoric. For example, here at San Diego State, we had tons of posters that were calling our students from minority groups things that are very disrespectful, which is not true, associating them with things that are not. And us as an institution, we really put a focus on how could we have a positive campus climate for everyone, especially for our vulnerable groups. And one of the things that we've done is created our bias response system. And at San Diego State, we call it, in many institutions, it's called bias response system. At SDSU, we call it inclusive SDSU. This is a avenue where if someone is dealing with a bias or hate crime, or there's an issue that they've been targeted with that is negative, they automatically submit a report. They could upload, if they see a flyer that is, a white supremacy or white nationalist flyer on campus, which we do get, just like any other campuses, once we get that, it normally comes to me and a few other individuals like, the dean of students and the associate vice president for diversity. We're able to respond, and we're able to create, the initiatives that we need to prevent it from happening. Another thing is, a lot of, focus on training. For example, at San Diego State, we do a lot of training on microaggressions, and implicit bias trainings. We do it for our police department. We do it for our faculty. We do it for our staff and students. And that really builds a culture of acceptance. A lot of times, you know, a faculty member or a student or a member of a campus community could feel like he's supporting, someone who's from a minority community where they're not, and they're, using microaggressions or implicit bias against them. So, to avoid that, we're providing those trainings, and just always being ahead of the curve. We hope nothing bad happens, but hope is not strategy. And you could see that, college campuses across the country, they're not militarized. And anyone that wants to harm students could really relatively have easy access to campus. And that's one of the things that worries me oftentimes. So we need to be very vigilant. We need to condemn when we see rhetoric that is, problematic, and not just, hide behind this is, protected speech. Obviously respecting the Constitution, but, higher education institutions need to understand, what is acceptable speech on campus as well. So a lot of those things could, help create a culture of acceptance, and also providing resource centers and resource areas for our communities. I remember as an undergraduate student at San Diego State, when it was time for me to pray, either I would used to go pray behind a stairwell or a rooftop, oftentimes, being, vulnerable to anyone to attack us. And now the institution has, provided incredible resource centers, such as, the Center for Intercultural Relations, where a lot of our immigrant and refugee Muslim students utilize. We have a mind, body, and spirit room. Anybody that needs a place to pray, meditate, they have access to space where they're not, doing it out in the parking lot. So a lot of these things that include students are making a tremendous impact and effort.
All right, thank you very much for that, Professor. Looks like we have time for one more question, and this is for you, Cindy. From the chat, since the Trump administration, are immigrant and refugee communities at a greater risk of violent extremism based upon your experience?
It's hard to actually pinpoint what all the causes of the current trends are. I would say the hate speech on the internet, the growth of hate speech and platforms on the internet has a great deal to do with it. I think it is important to ensure that Department of Justice speaks with one voice and makes it clear that they do stand to protect immigrants, refugees from hate crimes. We have, for example, right now we have a COVID-19 hate crimes task force to protect Asian Americans from the hate crimes they're experiencing. It has to be, completely uniform and across the board for all immigrants and all refugees. And I would say within DOJ, I do see a very, very strong commitment. It is troubling, particularly the internet hate speech. I think some of the divisive things that we see on radio and cable TV contribute to this, that we all need to be particularly aware of how that speech does affect what happens out in the public venue, and how people who have an extremist mentality or an inclination to move towards violence may react to those signals.
Thank you very much for that response. That is going to conclude our program for this evening. But before we go, I definitely want to thank each of our wonderful presenters for affording us the opportunity to learn and create this very meaningful, very necessary dialogue so that we can make a difference through education and through understanding. I would also like to encourage everyone that's tuning in to take a look at the SDSU Cares Facebook page, as well as our Twitter. Follow both of those for updates. We will be here same time, 4 o'clock next week, as we unpack hate and we'll have another great cast of presenters to be able to create some additional dialogue so that we can further promote this great vision through the McCain Institute and through peer-to-peer protected projects. So thank you all. I will remain on the call here for the next maybe 5 minutes if anybody has any follow-on questions or specific questions to our wonderful presenters. But thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Jamar. Thank you for the invitation, Mohammed.